All right, we have been looking at some of the origin stories in Genesis, the roots of our faith. In particular, we've been looking at the significance of names, in many ways, the power of names. So we started with creation, where Adam names all the animals, and relationships begin to be formed between us and all creation. We looked at the story, the naming of Isaac, an impossible promise that was made true. Last week we looked at the renaming of Jacob to Israel, the one who wrestled with God as a model of faith formation for many of us as well. And today we're going to take a look at the story of Moses and how God gives us a name for us to be able to relate and be able to call upon the Lord. Names are important, right? It's how we form relationships. At the end of a movie, they usually roll the credits, right? And they name all the people who helped create the movie. Diane and I are some of those people who stay in there the whole time. We wait to the very end because you never know. Sometimes there's an Easter egg. There's a little surprise sometimes that they sneak in at the end. Plus, I love to see where things were filmed or where things were created. And I'm amazed at the number of people it takes to create something to do that. So but every once in a while, as you're looking through all the characters as they're listed, you notice sometimes they have bystander number 1 or waitress number 3. They're not given a name, and we know if they're not given a name, they're probably not integral to the telling of the story, because if they were important for the story, they're given a name. Well, so to pay attention as we read our scripture reading today. It's interesting to find out who is it that's named and who is it that doesn't get named. So the primary ones that we hear getting named are Moses and God, who reveals God's name. The only other 2 names that we hear in our reading today are 2 midwives. Their names are Shiphrah and Puah. So names are important, all right? We honor someone if we take time to learn their name. Sometimes when we love someone, we maybe even give them a name, like a nickname, shows us the special relationship that we might have with them. Our second daughter, her name is Katrina, but growing up we called her Katie. But only family members and people who knew her when she was little call her Katie. The rest of the world calls her Katrina. And so if someone refers to her as Katrina, I know this is someone who knew her when she was very young. And it's always interesting as we're, especially with the grandkids now, we're always trying out different nicknames, see what's going to stick and what goes with that. Well, on the other side, we know that sometimes you can give someone a derogatory or unwanted nickname. Happens on the playgrounds all the time as a way of hurting someone or belittling someone, and bullies all around the world will oftentimes use nicknames to put people down. All right, so we're going to look at the story here, but again, context is important. The story of Genesis traces these promises of God to bless the whole world, and he uses one particular family to do that, family of Abraham. Abraham passed on to Isaac. Isaac passes on to Jacob. If you might remember from last week, Jacob then had 12 sons, 4 different mothers. By 4 different mothers, he had 12 sons. A quarter of the book of Genesis is dedicated to telling the story of one of those sons. Jacob's favorite son, his name was Joseph. And this has this big, long story, a quarter of the book. All right, through this big, long process, Joseph ends up in Egypt as Pharaoh's right-hand man. And when famine strikes, Jacob's whole family then uproots again, as they have throughout each generation had moved, and emigrates down to Egypt. And they're welcomed to live there. But time passes and things change. So we're going to pick up from Exodus chapter 1. It says, a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Now, every time there's a new administration, there's a possibility that things are going to change. And certainly that's the case we hear here as well. So he continues by saying this. He said to the people, look, the Israelite people are more numerous and powerful than we are. Let us deal shrewdly with them, or they will increase, and in event of a war, they would join our enemies and fight against us and escape the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to oppress them with forced labor. They built supply cities, Pithom and Ramses, for Pharaoh. But the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and spread, so the Egyptians came to dread the Israelites. The Egyptians became ruthless in imposing tasks on the Israelites. They made their lives bitter with hard service and mortar and brick and every kind of field labor. They were ruthless in all the tasks they imposed on them. So we can pause the story just for a second here. What's going on? New Pharaoh come in. He wants to consolidate his power. Often there are rival factions in politics, as we're very much aware, but the best way, if you're going to consolidate your power, is to find a common enemy that everyone can blame. And for this new Pharaoh, it was these Hebrew immigrants, right? And so he found a way to dehumanize them, turn them, no, they were no longer people, they became slaves, because Pharaoh was afraid of them. He tries working them to death, making their life so unpleasant that might break their spirit, but it doesn't work. So Pharaoh has to go for a final solution. He turns to genocide. Picking up verse 15. The king of Egypt said to the Hebrew midwives, one of them named Shiphrah, the other Puah, when you act as midwives to the Hebrew women and see them on the birth stool, if it's a boy, kill him. If it's a girl, she can live. But the midwives feared God. They did not do as the king of Egypt commanded them, but they let the boys live. So the king of Egypt summoned the midwives. He said to them, why have you done this? Why have you allowed the boys to live? Midwives said to Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, for they're vigorous. They give birth before the midwife even comes to them. So God dealt well with the midwives, and the people multiplied and became very strong. And because the midwives feared God, God gave them families. I love this part of the story. Part of me says, well, why was it so important to include this in telling the story of Moses? But I love this story. Courageous women willing to stand up to power at the risk of their own lives to defend the lives of those that were the most vulnerable. And their names then are lifted up for history, right? To remember their bravery. Pharaoh's name isn't. We have no idea which Pharaoh this may have been. They use the title Pharaoh, but they never tell us of all the pharaohs there were which Pharaoh this might have been. So it's interesting. The midwives are named. Moses' parents aren't named, and Moses gets, at least not in this part of it. So here's my interesting theory. I think that the reason that Shiphrah and Puah are named as well as Moses is that they were all in the same business, right? They were assisting to give birth, whether it was to an individual or to a nation. They were both, God was calling both of them to be part of this process of renewing this promise he had made to make them a numerous people, a great nation. Anyway, Pharaoh throws a temper tantrum. His policies are not being followed, so he tries another means to exert his control. So verse 22 says, Pharaoh commanded all his people, every boy that is born to the Hebrews you shall throw into the Nile, but you shall let every girl live. And then the story turns to a particular family of slaves. They're facing this agonizing decision. How would they save this boy child that is born to them? If they did nothing, their child would die for sure. So they take this dangerous risk, a desperate act, to try to save their child. Chapter 3. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a Levite woman. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw he was a fine baby, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him, plastered it with bitumen and pitch, and put the child in it, and placed it among the reeds in the bank of the river. Her sister stood at a distance to see what would happen. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river, and her attendants walked beside the river, and she saw the basket among the reeds and sent her maid to bring it. When she opened it, she saw the child. He was crying, so she took pity on him. This must be one of the Hebrew children, she said. And then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get you a nurse from the Hebrew woman to nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Yes." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child, nurse it for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed it. When the child grew up, she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she took him as her son. She named him Moses, because she said, "I drew him out of the water," which is what the word Moses means. Another interesting little thing here, the word for the basket, this papyrus basket that was used to save Moses from the waters, from drowning like all the others did, it's the same word we translate in Genesis as ark, right? What she built was an ark to save Moses from being drowned in the Nile. Well, this child grows up in Pharaoh's court, right under Pharaoh's nose, unaware of his true identity, and this secret is kept for many years. Kept until Moses, now grown, witnesses the injustice and the brutality of the taskmasters against the slaves. And he murders one of them, and because of that, he needs to flee for his life. And he runs away to the land of Midian, and while he's working there, he takes up work as a shepherd. So we're going to skip some of that part of the journey and becoming a shepherd and all that a little later in the chapter. Moses was keeping the flock of his father Jethro, a priest in Midian. He led his flock beyond the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. There an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of a bush. He looked, the bush was blazing, yet it was not consumed. Moses said, "I must turn aside. Look at this great sight. Why is this bush not being burned up?" When the Lord saw he had turned aside to see, God called to him from the bush. "Moses, Moses," he said. "Here I am." And he said to him, "Come no closer. Remove the sandals from your feet, for the place on which you're standing is holy ground." He said further, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at the face of God. I often think of the presence of God as being a comforting thing. I let people know, it says, God is with you. But when faced with this awesome power that's beyond our control, the presence of God can also be a very humbling and maybe at times even a fearful thing. So God speaks to Moses to assure him he's there because of a relationship with his ancestors. Verse 7 goes like this. It says, "Then the Lord said, I have observed the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cry on account of the taskmasters. I know their suffering. I have come down to deliver them. The cry of the Israelites has come to me. I have seen how the Egyptians oppress them. So come, I will send you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt." Moses said to God, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring Israelites out of Egypt?" And God said, "I will be with you. This will be the sign that it is I who sent you. When you brought the people out of Egypt, you shall worship God on this mountain." But Moses said to God, "If I come to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your ancestors had sent me,' they'll ask me, 'What is his name?' What shall I say to them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said further, "You shall say to the Israelites, 'I am has sent me to you.'" God also said to Moses, "Thus you shall say to the Israelites, 'The Lord, which is the name I am. The God of your ancestors, the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever. This is my title for all generations. All right, so powerful, epic kind of story. But what does it mean for us? There's lots of things in there. There's no one meaning. If you're someone who's feeling oppressed, know that God hears our cries and sends those to help us. Or maybe a challenge for us to open our eyes and ears that God might be the one calling us to be the answer to someone else's prayer. But whatever the call, the promise is the same. We are not alone. The God of all creation loves us, calls us by name, and will not let us go. Amen. All right, Joan, we're going to dust off the organ this morning, and let's rise if you are able. Sing a little bit this powerful old hymn, How Great Thou Art. It speaks of the wonder and the power, the presence of God.